The silence was the first thing that struck Sergeant Elias Thorne. Even before the oppressive humidity began to cling to his fatigues, it was a silence deeper than any he'd known in the bustling, scarred cities they usually patrolled. Here, in the sprawling, primeval forest that hugged the disputed borderlands, the only sounds were the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth and the rhythmic, soft padding of Echo's paws beside him, Elias's K9 partner, a magnificent Belgian Malinois, moved with an almost ethereal grace, his senses constantly scanning, processing information long before Elias's human ears could register a whisper. Elias clutched the worn grip of his rifle, his gaze sweeping through the dense canopy of ancient trees that blotted out the midday sun, casting the forest floor in perpetual twilight. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, every rustle a potential threat. He'd seen too much, lost too much. In these endless conflicts, the weight of those memories was a constant companion, a heavy cloak he wore beneath his uniform. Only with Echo, his loyal, unblinking shadow, did that weight sometimes lessen. Echo was more than a service dog. He was an anchor in a world that often felt adrift. Their mission was routine, a recon patrol, marking out potential infiltration routes, ensuring the fragile peace holding in this sector wasn't a prelude to another storm. It was monotonous work, vital but rarely dramatic. Elias had been mentally preparing to call in their status, to confirm the sector was clear, to report the same nothing he'd reported for the last 3 rotations. The air hung thick and still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was a silence that was almost unnerving, a stark contrast to the distant echoes of human suffering they usually encountered. A silence that lulled, a deceptive blanket suggesting safety where none truly existed. It was precisely this eerie tranquility that would, in mere moments, be shattered in a way Elias could never have anticipated. Elias lifted his radio to his mouth, fingers already reaching for the comms button. Bravo 6 to command. Sector clear. No unusual. He stopped mid-sentence. A shiver, not of cold, but of something primal, ran down his spine. Echo, who had been moving with his usual fluid grace, suddenly froze. His ears swiveled, twitching almost imperceptibly. His body taut with an intensity Elias recognized immediately. It was the same posture Echo adopted when he detected a hidden explosive, a sniper, or an enemy patrol. But here, in this suffocating silence, there was nothing. No scent of cordite, no distant murmur of voices. Just the thick, humid air. What is it? Boy, Elias murmured, lowering the radio, his gaze sweeping the trees again, searching for the unseen threat that had so alerted his partner. Echo let out a low, almost imperceptible whine, a sound so unlike his usual stoic demeanor that Elias felt a jolt of alarm. Then he heard it. Faint. Carried on a whisper of wind that seemed to thread its way directly to his ears. A sound that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. It was a child's voice. Barely a murmur, easily dismissed as the rustling of leaves or the cry of a bird, but undeniably human, and laced with raw, desperate terror that cut through the silence like a jagged blade. Echo's head snapped towards a particularly dense thicket of thorny bushes, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Please don't let my brother die. The words were fragmented, choked with sobs. But the plea was unmistakable. It wasn't a cry for help in general. It was a desperate, agonizing whisper for a specific, fragile life. The sound was so impossibly small, so utterly out of place in this vast, indifferent wilderness, that for a moment, Elias wondered if his own fractured mind was playing tricks on him. But Echo's rigid stance, his focused gaze, confirmed it. This wasn't a phantom. This was real. The routine. The silence, the perceived safety, all of it shattered in an instant by the heart-wrenching plea of a child. His mission had just changed. The desperate plea, fragile as it was, ignited something fierce within Elias. He secured his rifle, switching the safety on, and gave Echo a silent command. The K9 immediately surged forward, nose to the ground, pulling Elias through the thorny undergrowth. The forest, once a cloak of deceptive quiet, now felt like a labyrinth designed to thwart their urgent progress. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves beneath their boots, seemed amplified, a grim counterpoint to the racing beat of Elias's heart. Echo led them deeper, past gnarled roots and vines that snaked across the path like tripwires. The air grew heavier, more stagnant, as they descended into a small, natural depression in the terrain. Then, Echo paused, letting out a soft, urgent whine, his tail giving a single, quick thump against Elias's leg. Through a sparse curtain of hanging moss and tangled ferns, Elias saw it, a makeshift shelter, crudely fashioned from broken branches and large, tattered leaves, barely big enough to conceal two small figures. It was a pathetic, fragile attempt at refuge, speaking volumes about the desperation of its inhabitants. He approached cautiously, rifle ready, his voice low and calm. "Hello, is anyone there?" A gasp from within. Then, a tiny figure, no older than 7, scrambled out, her eyes wide with terror. Her clothes were torn and muddied, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Her small hands were clenched, trembling, but in their grip. She held a large, splintered branch, a futile weapon against the unknown. Her dark hair was matted, framing a face etched with a maturity that belied her tender age. "Please, don't hurt us," she whispered, her voice barely a breath, but holding an astonishing resolve. Elias lowered his rifle further, showing her his open hands. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help." Echo, sensing the girl's fear, sat patiently beside Elias, his gaze soft, a silent assurance. The girl hesitated for another agonizing moment, her eyes darting between Elias and the large, imposing K9. Then, her gaze flickered back to the dark opening of the shelter, and the last shred of her protective facade crumbled. "My brother, he's sick. He's dying." She backed away, revealing the interior of the makeshift lean-to. Inside, huddled on a bed of damp leaves, lay an even smaller boy. He was deathly pale, his breath shallow and ragged, his lips were cracked, and his forehead glistened with sweat. Even in the cool, shaded interior of the shelter, a deep, angry wound, crudely bandaged with a strip of what looked like torn cloth, was visible on his leg, already showing signs of serious infection. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The raw, desperate plea he'd heard on the wind now manifested itself in this heartbreaking tableau: 2 children, utterly alone, facing the brutal indifference of the wilderness and the unseen dangers that lurked within it. It was a scene of such profound vulnerability and suffering that it pierced through Elias's hardened exterior, stirring echoes of forgotten pain and a fierce, immediate need to act. "Alara," her name whispered through choked sobs, finally lowered the branch, her small shoulders slumping in exhaustion. Elias knelt, keeping a respectful distance, his eyes on the feverish boy. "What happened here? Alara? Where are your parents?" Her eyes, remarkably lucid despite her ordeal, darted to the dark forest beyond their meager shelter. "The men, they came, with guns." Her voice was a fragile whisper, yet it held the weight of unspeakable trauma. "They burned our village. Mama and Papa. They told us to run, to hide in the woods, to find our aunt in the next valley." Her voice cracked, a fresh wave of tears tracing clean paths through the dirt on her cheeks. But Finn, he fell. He got hurt when we were running, and now he won't wake up properly. He won't. She looked at her brother, her gaze fierce with a love so pure it was almost unbearable to witness. We've been here for many suns. I tried to find help. I tried to make him better, but he just gets hotter. Her small hand, calloused and scraped, reached out to touch Finn's forehead, then recoiled from the searing heat. Elias's mind raced. A burned village. Men with guns. It painted a grim picture of the ongoing, brutal conflict that often spilled over into innocent communities. He'd seen it countless times, but never so raw. So immediate. So heartbreakingly focused on two defenseless children. Alara's unwavering resolve. Her desperate, almost primal need to protect her younger brother. Struck a chord deep within him. He remembered his own little sister. Sarah, her bright laugh, her trusting eyes. The memory, usually a source of crushing pain, now fueled a fierce protective fire. He'd failed to protect Sarah, but he wouldn't fail these children. Not if he could help it. He needs help. Please. Alara pleaded, her eyes fixed on Elias. A desperate flicker of hope finally daring to ignite within them. He's all I have left. Her words were not just a request, they were an unspoken plea for justice. For a flicker of light in her endless darkness, they solidified Elias's resolve. He wasn't just a soldier anymore, he was her last hope, the quiet plea. He's all I have left. Resonated deep within Elias. It wasn't just a child's desperate cry, it was an echo of his own profound loss. A mirror reflecting a grief he'd buried under layers of duty and stoicism. Sarah, his little sister, her face, vivid and heartbreakingly young, flashed before his eyes. He remembered the helpless rage he'd felt, the crushing weight of knowing he hadn't been there, hadn't been able to protect her from the senseless violence that had stolen her life. That failure had haunted him, driven him, and ultimately hardened him. But looking at Alara, seeing her fierce, unwavering love for her ailing brother, something shifted within Elias. The ice around his heart began to crack. His comms crackled, a voice from command asking for his status. Elias ignored it, pulling his earpiece out. The military protocol, the rigid chain of command, the preset mission parameters, all of it faded into insignificance in the face of the raw human suffering before him. He was a soldier, yes, but first and foremost, he was a human being, and these were children, abandoned and dying. He moved closer to Finn, his training kicking in. He carefully pushed aside the tattered cloth that served as a bandage. The wound was deep, jagged, and inflamed, angry red streaks already creeping up the boy's pale leg. Infection. Without immediate medical attention, Finn wouldn't last much longer. His breathing was shallow, his small chest barely rising and falling. Elias glanced at Alara, her small frame rigid with fear and hope. He saw the desperate plea in her eyes, felt the unspoken trust she was placing in him. A stranger with a gun and a dog. It was a terrifying responsibility, a burden heavier than any pack he'd ever carried. His orders were clear: avoid civilian interference. Report findings. Do not engage. But leaving them here was not an option. It was a choice between following rules and upholding a moral imperative. For Elias, there was no choice. He looked directly into Alara's eyes, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the thundering resolve in his chest. Listen to me, Alara, my name is Elias. This is Echo. He gestured to the K9 who had settled calmly beside him, his amber eyes fixed on the children. We are going to help your brother. I promise you. The word promise hung in the air. A sacred vow. It wasn't just a platitude, it was an oath, born of his own past failures and a renewed sense of purpose. He would not let another child suffer the same fate as Sarah. He would not abandon these innocent lives. This was no longer just a recon patrol, it was a rescue mission. Deeply personal. Infinitely more important than any military objective. Alara's eyes, which had been clouded with despair, now shimmered with a fragile, dawning hope. A tiny, almost imperceptible nod. That simple gesture, that silent trust, solidified Elias's conviction. He was committing to something far outside his mandate, risking court-martial, potentially even his life. But he knew, with a clarity that resonated through his very bones, that it was the right thing to do. He began to rummage through his pack, pulling out a small field medical kit. His supplies were limited, designed for superficial wounds and emergency stabilization. Not for treating a severe infection in a child. He had some antiseptic wipes, a roll of sterile gauze, and a single vial of broad-spectrum antibiotics. Meant for himself in a dire emergency. He would have to make them count. "Alara," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I need you to be brave for me. Very brave. Your brother needs you to be strong." She nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, her small chin trembling but held high. Elias carefully cleaned the wound on Finn's leg, trying to ignore the boy's faint whimper of pain. He hated seeing children suffer, hated the impotence of feeling that his strength and training were so woefully inadequate against the forces that inflicted such cruelty. He poured the antiseptic solution, a precious few drops, onto the wound, watching the girl wince in sympathy. As he worked, Echo shifted, his head cocked slightly, a low, almost inaudible growl rumbling in his chest. Elias paused, his senses on high alert. Echo rarely made a sound unless there was genuine cause for alarm. The forest, which had momentarily felt like a sanctuary, now seemed to press in on them, its silence once again becoming a source of dread. They weren't alone. Elias felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. They were exposed, vulnerable, and the decision he'd just made to stay and help these children had just put them all in grave danger. His oath, made in a moment of emotional clarity, now came with an immediate, terrifying price. Elias felt the subtle shift in the air, a prickle of unease that wasn't just his imagination. Echo's low growl, barely a vibration in his chest, confirmed it. They weren't alone. He carefully finished securing the makeshift bandage on Finn's leg, his movements precise despite the surge of adrenaline. The wound looked angry, swollen, and a faint, sickly odor emanated from it. He knew with a grim certainty. That infection was setting in rapidly. "He's got a bad fever," Elias murmured, more to himself than to Alara. He placed a hand on Finn's small forehead. It was burning hot, almost feverish enough to cause delirium. "And the wound, it needs proper medical attention. Fast." He glanced at his own limited medical kit, a few rolls of gauze, some antiseptic wipes, and the precious, solitary vial of broad-spectrum antibiotics. It was a paltry arsenal against what threatened to consume the boy. He extracted a small, sealed packet from his kit. "Alara, can you hold this?" He handed her a rehydration tablet, signaling her to mix it with the last of their clean water in his canteen. "Give him sips, as much as he can take." Hydration was critical, especially with the fever, while Alara carefully administered the water, her small hands trembling. Elias focused on Echo. The dog was now facing the dense thicket opposite their makeshift shelter, his ears swiveling, nose twitching. He was picking up something, a scent, a sound, a disturbance in the otherwise still air. Elias silently unholstered his sidearm, keeping it low and out of sight from Alara. Yet ready. The sense of being watched was almost palpable, a heavy weight pressing down on them. "Echo, show me," Elias whispered. Giving the K9 a subtle hand signal, Echo responded instantly, moving slowly, deliberately, towards the edge of the clearing, his body language communicating extreme caution. He wasn't tracking an animal, he was tracking something human. Something dangerous. The silence that had initially lulled them into a false sense of security now felt oppressive, amplifying every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call. Elias's mind raced, calculating risks, moving a feverish, injured child through this terrain would be agonizingly slow, making them easy targets. Staying put, however, meant risking discovery by whoever was out there. And Finn's condition was worsening by the minute. It was a brutal calculus of survival. He scanned the immediate vicinity, trying to identify potential escape routes, natural cover, anything that could give them an edge. The forest was thick, a maze of ancient trees and tangled undergrowth, but it also offered countless places for an enemy to hide. How much time do we have? Elias thought aloud, his gaze sweeping from Finn's pale face to the impenetrable tree line. The antibiotics would buy them a few hours, maybe a day if they were lucky, but a child this young, with a wound this severe, could succumb quickly. The thought filled him with a cold dread. He was a soldier, trained for combat, not a medic. He was out of his element, but failure was not an option. He had made a promise. He carefully administered a portion of the liquid antibiotic to Finn, holding the boy's head gently as he swallowed. The boy coughed weakly, his eyes fluttering for a moment before closing again. Elias felt a surge of helplessness. He needed more than just a few drops of medicine. He needed a clinic, a doctor, proper facilities, all of which were miles away, across treacherous, potentially hostile territory. Alara watched him with wide, solemn eyes, absorbing every move. Her quiet presence was a constant reminder of the stakes. He saw the resilience in her, a strength that defied her years, but also the deep, abiding fear for her brother. He had to succeed. Echo let out another low growl, a little louder this time, followed by a series of quick barks, sharper, more insistent. His head snapped towards a cluster of thick ferns, his hackles rising almost imperceptibly. Elias knew that bark. It wasn't playful, it was a warning. Whoever was out there, they were close. Too close. We have to move, Elias whispered, urgency lacing his voice. He quickly gathered their meager supplies, stuffing them back into his pack. He then turned to Finn, gently sliding his arms under the boy. Finn was light, too light, his small body burning with fever. Alara, can you walk? She nodded, already scrambling to her feet, her small hand instinctively reaching for Elias's pant leg. Yes, I can, as Elias carefully lifted Finn into his arms. A twig snapped nearby, distinct and undeniable. It wasn't an animal. It was a human footstep, heavy and deliberate. They had been found. The clock had not just been ticking, it had run out. The harsh realities of their isolated location, Finn's rapidly deteriorating health, and the unseen eyes watching them had converged into a single, terrifying moment of truth. They were exposed, vulnerable, and the fight for Finn's life was about to become a desperate race against an unknown, deadly enemy. The sharp crack of the twig was undeniable, slicing through the thick forest air like a gunshot. Elias froze, Finn's feather-light body cradled awkwardly in his arms. Echo, sensing the imminent threat, let out a furious, guttural bark, a sound that ripped through the oppressive silence. He lunged forward, not at an enemy he could see, but at the dense wall of foliage where the sound had originated. Stay behind me, Alara, Elias commanded, his voice a low, urgent rasp. He shifted Finn's weight, trying to adjust his grip while simultaneously reaching for his rifle, which he'd leaned against a tree. The seconds stretched into an eternity. He had to make a choice: shield the children or prepare for combat. The instinct to protect was overwhelming. He pulled the boy tighter to his chest, twisting his body to shield Alara with his free arm. Echo's barks intensified, turning into a series of ferocious snarls. The dog was a blur of motion, tearing at the undergrowth. But there was no visible target. It was as if he was fighting a ghost. Then, a low chuckle, chillingly close, drifted from the shadows. Well, look what we have here. A lost lamb and her shepherd. The voice was coarse, laced with menace, and unmistakably male. Elias's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. Or at least, the type of man who spoke with such arrogant cruelty. This wasn't a random encounter. They had been tracked. "Show yourselves!" Elias roared, trying to pinpoint the source of the voice. But the dense foliage provided perfect cover for their unseen assailants. He could hear movement now, the rustle of leaves, the quiet scrape of boots. They were surrounded. No need to be so aggressive, soldier. Another voice sneered, this one from a different direction, equally close. "Just hand over the children. They belong to us. They belong to us." The words ignited a cold fury in Elias. These children were fleeing for their lives, their village burned, their family gone. No one belonged to these monsters. Echo suddenly let out a sharp yelp, a sound of pain, followed by a deeper growl of pure aggression. Elias's head snapped towards his partner. A dark, shadowy figure emerged from the undergrowth. A crude, heavy stick clutched in his hand. He had clearly struck Echo. "Leave him alone!" Elias yelled, his voice raw with anger. He knew Echo could handle himself, but the sight of his loyal partner being attacked sent a wave of primal rage through him. The first figure, a burly man with a cruel smile, stepped into the meager light of the clearing behind him. Two more armed men appeared, their faces grim, their weapons raised. They were militia, their uniforms mismatched, but their intent clear. They moved with a predatory slowness, encircling Elias and the children. "Such a noble soldier," the burly man mocked, his eyes lingering on Finn and Elias's arms. "Playing nursemaid to strays." He gestured with his stick towards Alara, who was clutching Elias's leg, her small body trembling. "The girl is ours, the boy." "Well, he's a liability, isn't he? We can simplify things. You're not touching them." Elias growled, his grip on Finn tightening. He knew his rifle was only a few feet away, but retrieving it meant exposing himself and the children. He was outmatched, outgunned, and burdened by the precious cargo in his arms. Or what? "Soldier," another militiaman taunted, raising his rifle. "You think you can fight 3 armed men with a sick child in your arms and a dog that's already tasted our hospitality?" Echo, despite the blow, was back on his feet, circling the men, a low, menacing snarl vibrating in his chest. He was ready to defend, even against impossible odds. Elias's mind raced, desperate for an opening, a weakness. He cursed himself for not being more vigilant, for allowing the deceptive silence to lull him into a false sense of security. He had let his guard down, and now 2 innocent lives, and his own, hung precariously in the balance. "Last chance." "Soldier," the burly man said, taking a step closer, his eyes glinting with malicious intent. "Hand them over, or we take them by force. And believe me, you won't like the alternative for the boy." The implied threat sent a cold wave of dread through Elias. They were willing to harm Finn. He had to act. He couldn't fight them head-on with Finn in his arms. He needed a diversion, a way to create enough chaos to get the children to safety. And then, he would deal with these monsters. The silent hunt was over. The desperate chase was about to begin. The unseen eyes had revealed themselves, and they belonged to pure malevolence. The burly militiaman took another step forward, his crude stick scraping menacingly against the forest floor. His eyes, cold and calculating, were fixed on Finn. Elias felt a surge of cold fury, a primal urge to protect. He knew, with terrifying certainty, that these men would not hesitate to harm the boy. He could feel Alara trembling against his leg, her small hand clutching his fatigues like a lifeline. "I won't let you touch them," Elias stated, his voice low and guttural, a stark contrast to the thundering beat of his heart. His eyes darted, searching for an escape, a flicker of an opening. He was a trained soldier, but he was holding a feverish child, and his canine partner, though formidable, had just taken a blow. "Ha ha! Foolish soldier," the man scoffed, raising his stick. "You think you can defy the new order?" He gestured vaguely, encompassing the entire, vast forest. "These lands belong to Volkov, and anyone who defies him belongs in the ground." The name hit Elias like a physical blow. Volkov? Commander Volkov? The name resonated with a chilling familiarity, stirring up a dark, buried corner of his memory. He'd heard that name before, whispered in hushed tones in intelligence briefings, linked to unspeakable atrocities. Volkov was a ghost, a phantom responsible for numerous disappearances, massacres, and the systematic displacement of entire communities. He was a local warlord, once a minor figure, but whose influence had seemingly grown, feeding on the chaos of the region. But it was more than just a name from a file. Elias remembered a specific incident, years ago, when a village on the outskirts of their operational zone had been brutally attacked. It was the same attack that had, indirectly, led to the loss of his sister, Sarah. She had been on a humanitarian aid mission, far too close to the expanding conflict, and had gone missing in the chaos that followed Volkov's initial rise to power. Official reports had been vague, attributing it to insurgent activity. But rumors had always pointed to Volkov and his ruthless militia. Now, looking at Alara, listening to her fragmented whispers about her village being burned, seeing the desperate fear in her eyes, a horrifying realization dawned on Elias. The insignia on the burly man's arm, a stylized wolf's head, fangs bared, it was Volkov's emblem. The same emblem he'd seen in old intelligence photos. The same one associated with the attack that stole Sarah. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This was their militia. This was Volkov's terror. And these children, Ilara and Finn, were not just refugees, they were direct victims of the very evil that had scarred Elias's own life. A cold, bitter rage began to simmer beneath Elias's calm exterior. He had sought justice for Sarah in the anonymity of combat, fighting the abstract enemy. But here, standing before him, was a direct link to the very source of his pain. This wasn't just about rescuing two children anymore. It was about confronting the shadow of his past, about delivering the justice he had been denied. "So, the little girl talks. Does she?" The burly man sneered, noticing Alara's wide, terrified eyes fixed on him. "It doesn't matter. No one will believe a child of the forest, and certainly not a dead soldier." He raised his stick higher, clearly intending to strike. This was Elias's moment. He couldn't let them have the children. He wouldn't let history repeat itself. "Echo!" Elias bellowed. A primal roar that surprised even himself. It was a command, fierce and urgent. One Echo instinctively understood, in a flash of golden-brown fur. Echo launched himself forward. Not at the burly man, but at the militiaman holding the rifle to Elias's right. It was a calculated risk. Echo's charge was sudden, vicious, aimed not to kill but to disarm and disorient. The militiaman cried out as Echo slammed into his legs, sending him sprawling, his rifle skittering across the leaves. The burly man paused, momentarily stunned by Echo's ferocity. That was all Elias needed. He spun, leveraging Finn's weight, and delivered a powerful, desperate kick to the burly man's knee. The man roared in pain, his stick clattering to the ground as he crumpled. "Go run, Ilara!" Elias yelled, pushing Ilara away from him towards a narrow, overgrown path he'd spotted earlier. Go hide! He couldn't run with Finn in his arms. He had to draw their fire, buy Ilara time. But as he turned to retrieve his rifle, the third militiaman, quicker than the others, raised his weapon, a flash of muzzle fire, and a searing pain erupted in Elias's left shoulder. He cried out, stumbling backward, but he held onto Finn, shielding him instinctively. The shot galvanized Echo. He abandoned the disarmed militiaman and lunged at the shooter, his jaws clamping down on the man's arm. The man screamed, dropping his rifle, trying to dislodge the powerful K9. Run. Ilara. Elias gasped, pushing Finn gently into her arms, ignoring the blossoming agony in his shoulder. Take Finn, run, hide him. He knew this was a desperate gamble, entrusting Finn's fragile life to a child, but it was their only chance. He had to engage, to draw their attention. Ilara, with an astonishing surge of strength and courage, wrapped her arms around her brother, half dragging, half carrying him, scrambling into the dense undergrowth, disappearing from sight. Elias, now unburdened, lunged for his own rifle, ignoring the throbbing pain. The burly man was struggling to his feet, yelling orders. The other militiaman was still grappling with Echo, who clung to his arm with unyielding determination. Elias had his rifle now. He wouldn't let them get away. This wasn't just a rescue anymore, this was personal. The shadow of his past had risen, and he would confront it head-on. He would fight for these children, for Sarah, for every innocent life lost to Volkov's tyranny. The chase was on, but this time, Elias was hunting. The searing pain in Elias's shoulder was a dull roar compared to the explosive surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. The world narrowed to a tunnel, focusing solely on the immediate threats. The militiaman Echo was grappling with shrieked, desperately trying to pry the K9's jaws from his arm. The burly man, nursing his injured knee, scrambled for his fallen stick, his face contorted with rage. Elias, moving on instinct, swung his rifle up, aiming at the militiaman struggling with Echo. He didn't fire. A shot here would only draw more attention, and he needed to secure Finn and Ilara. Instead, he used the rifle butt to deliver a swift, sharp blow to the militiaman's head, just hard enough to daze him. The man groaned and sagged. Releasing Echo. Find them! Boy, protect them! Elias commanded, pointing in the direction Ilara had disappeared. Echo, ever loyal, let out a decisive bark and vanished into the undergrowth, a golden blur dedicated to his new, fragile charges. Now it was just Elias against the two remaining. Conscious militiaman, the burly one. His stick finally recovered, charged with a guttural roar. Elias sidestepped the wild swing, the heavy wood whistling past his ear, and countered with a fierce thrust of his rifle. The butt connected solidly with the man's gut, doubling him over with a pained grunt, just as Elias prepared to follow up. The third militiaman, the one Elias had hit with the rifle butt, staggered back to his feet, eyes glazed but clutching his own retrieved rifle. He pointed it wildly at Elias. "You're dead, soldier," he snarled, his finger twitching on the trigger. Elias knew he couldn't take another hit, especially not with Finn's life dependent on him. He dove for cover behind the thick trunk of an ancient oak, the militiaman's poorly aimed shots splintering bark around him. The forest, once silent, now echoed with gunfire. A terrifying symphony of pursuit. He peered around the tree, trying to gauge their positions. The burly man was limping, but recovering. The other was shaking off his daze. They were disorganized, but heavily armed and clearly ruthless. Elias had to draw them away from the children. He broke cover, firing a controlled burst high into the canopy, scattering leaves and sending birds screaming into the sky. It was a calculated risk announcing his presence, but also creating confusion. He then sprinted deeper into the woods, away from where Alara and Finn had vanished, deliberately making himself the primary target. "Get him!" the burly man bellowed, his voice laced with venom. "Don't let him get away." The chase was relentless. Elias, despite the burning pain in his shoulder, moved with the efficiency of a seasoned combatant. He utilized every shadow, every cluster of dense foliage, every uneven rise in the terrain to his advantage. He moved in a zigzag pattern, never staying in one place for too long, always forcing his pursuers to react. The sounds of their heavy boots crashing through the undergrowth and their frustrated shouts were his grim soundtrack. He could hear them getting closer sometimes, their voices sharp with renewed determination. Then, he would find a momentary advantage, like a sudden drop-off, a patch of treacherous mud, a thick curtain of vines, and gain precious ground. He wasn't just running, he was fighting a psychological battle, forcing them to expend energy, to make mistakes. His shoulder throbbed with every jarring step, a constant reminder of his vulnerability. He could feel the warmth of blood seeping through his uniform, but he pushed the pain aside. Finn, Alara, they were his sole focus. He imagined their small, terrified faces, remembered Ilara's desperate plea, and it fueled him, pushing him beyond what he thought were his limits. He knew this terrain was unfamiliar to him, but the militiamen seemed to navigate it with ease, suggesting they were locals, intimately familiar with every twist and turn. That was a disadvantage he had to overcome. He needed a plan, not just evasion. He needed to turn the tables. He found himself near a small, gurgling stream, its banks muddy and slick. A fallen tree bridged the gap. An idea sparked. He crossed quickly, then paused, taking aim at the weakest point of the log. A single, well-placed shot. The wood splintered, the log cracking and groaning before collapsing into the muddy water with a loud splash. "Damn it!" He heard one of the militiamen curse from the other side. He destroyed the bridge. That bought him a few precious minutes. Time to breathe. Time to think. He pressed on, deeper into the bewildering labyrinth of the forest. He could hear them now, trying to find another way across the stream, their angry shouts echoing through the trees. They were persistent, driven by Volkov's ruthless command. He reached a small, rocky outcrop, offering a brief moment of respite and a vantage point. He could see their pursuit party below him now, still struggling to cross the stream. There were more than just the two he'd initially engaged. He counted 5, all heavily armed. They must have been part of a larger patrol. He was truly outmatched, a flicker of movement in his periphery. He snapped his head around, rifle raised, heart pounding. It wasn't the militiaman. It was a lone figure, cloaked in dark, drab clothing, emerging from the deeper shadows of the forest. They weren't moving with the same aggressive clumsiness as Volkov's men. This figure moved with a quiet precision, almost like a hunter, friend or foe in this region. Under these circumstances, it was always safer to assume foe. The figure stopped, just at the edge of Elias's vision, partially obscured by a thick curtain of moss. They didn't make a sound. Elias gripped his rifle tighter, his breath shallow. His injured shoulder screamed in protest. He was running on fumes, and the enemy was closing in. He needed a miracle, or an unexpected ally. The figure at the edge of Elias's vision remained motionless, a dark silhouette against the dappled light of the forest. Elias kept his rifle trained on the spot, his finger hovering near the trigger. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the relentless throb in his injured shoulder. He was cornered, out of options, and running on fumes. He could hear the angry shouts of Volkov's men growing closer as they finally found a way to bypass the broken log. "Who's there?" Elias demanded, his voice hoarse, echoing through the trees. He needed to know if this was another threat, or if, by some divine intervention, a path to escape had opened. The figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, into a sliver of sunlight. It was a man, lean and wiry, dressed in simple, forest-worn clothes. His face was weathered, etched with the lines of hardship and a certain weariness, but his eyes, a startling shade of green, held a sharp intelligence, recognition, cold and immediate, washed over Elias. "Kyle!" Elias breathed, the name a whisper from a long-forgotten past. The man, Kale, gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod. "Sergeant Thorne, still causing trouble." "I see." His voice was low, raspy, but held a dry wit that Elias remembered. Kale, a local guide, known for his unparalleled knowledge of these treacherous borderlands. Elias had encountered him years ago during a particularly brutal winter operation. They had been on opposite sides of a tense, humanitarian standoff. Kyle advocating for his displaced people, Elias following military orders. Despite their initial conflict, a grudging respect had formed between them. Kyle had eventually helped Elias navigate a dangerous mountain pass, saving his unit from an ambush. And Elias had, in turn, ensured Kale's community received desperately needed aid. Their paths hadn't crossed since, but Elias had never forgotten the man's quiet strength and unwavering loyalty to his people. "I didn't expect to see you here," Elias said, still keeping his rifle up, albeit slightly lowered. Trust was a luxury in this land, even with old acquaintances. "Nor I you," Kyle replied, his gaze flickering from Elias's bloodied shoulder to the direction from which the malicious shouts were now clearly audible. "Sounds like you've made some powerful enemies." "Volkov's men," Elias stated, his jaw tight. "They're after the children." Kyle's green eyes, usually so stoic, hardened perceptibly. "Children? You brought children into this." His tone was sharp, accusing. Kyle had always been fiercely protective of the innocent lives caught in the crossfire of this perpetual war. They were alone, their village burned. Finn, the boy, he's badly hurt, feverish. Elias explained, his voice urgent. "I promised the girl, Alara, I wouldn't let him die. Echo is with them, trying to keep them hidden." Kyle's gaze softened, a flicker of something akin to pain crossing his face. He looked at Elias's shoulder, then back towards the approaching sounds of the militia. "Volkov has grown bold. Too bold." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "They are looking for you, for the children." "Why?" Alara said they were fleeing the burning of their village. "I think it's Volkov's purge." And Elias hesitated, then pushed past his ingrained military reticence. "The insignia on their uniforms. It's the same as the ones from the attacks years ago. The one that took my sister." A flicker of understanding, grim and profound, passed between them. Kyle remembered the stories, the whispers of Elias's personal tragedy. Though they had never discussed it directly, he understood the unspoken plea, the personal vendetta that now fueled the soldier's desperate actions. "You're injured," Kyle observed, his gaze assessing. "And outnumbered. You won't make it on your own." "I know," Elias admitted, gritting his teeth against a fresh wave of pain. "But I won't leave them. Not now. Not ever." Kyle looked past Elias, towards the distant shouts of the militiamen. He knew these woods, every hidden path, every shadowed crevice. He also knew Volkov's brutality, how his influence had spread like a cancer, crushing innocent lives. And he saw the desperation, the unyielding resolve in Elias's eyes, a reflection of his own past struggles. "There's an old path," Kyle finally said, his voice low. "Used by smugglers, then by refugees. It's dangerous, overgrown, but it will take you deep into the mountains, away from Volkov's patrols, to a place where you might find sanctuary. If you know where to look." Elias's hope surged, fragile but real. "You'll help." Kyle looked at him, then back towards the sounds of the approaching militiamen. "I owe you one, soldier, from long ago. And Volkov, he has taken too much from my people. Too many children have suffered because of his greed and cruelty." He met Elias's gaze, his eyes hard. "But we move fast. If they catch us, they will kill us all." He turned, a silent command in his posture. "Follow me, and trust my knowledge of these woods. Your K9 will find us." Elias didn't hesitate. He swung his rifle onto his back, wincing at the strain on his shoulder, and followed Kyle into the deeper, darker reaches of the forest. The unlikely alliance was forged not by military strategy, but by a shared past, a common enemy, and the desperate plea of a child. The chase continued, but now Elias had a guide, a silent, knowing presence who offered not just a path to safety, but perhaps a chance at true justice. The path ahead was perilous, but for the first time since hearing that faint, desperate cry, Elias felt a flicker of hope. Kale moved through the dense undergrowth with the silent grace of a phantom, a living embodiment of the forest itself. Elias, despite his throbbing shoulder and growing fatigue, followed close behind, his senses stretched to their limit. Kale's knowledge of the terrain was astonishing. He navigated through ancient, overgrown paths that Elias, even with his military training, would never have discerned. They moved through narrow ravines, scaled slippery rock faces, and skirted around treacherous bogs, always heading deeper into the mountains. Away from the sounds of Volkov's frustrated pursuit, the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. But the forest floor only grew darker, the shadows stretching into distorted, menacing shapes. Elias knew Echo, with his superior senses, would eventually catch up. But the thought of Alara and Finn, small and vulnerable, alone in this unforgiving wilderness, gnawed at him. He trusted Echo implicitly, but the stakes were unimaginably high as they pressed on. Kyle spoke in hushed tones, his voice a low murmur against the rustling leaves, painting a grim picture of Volkov's escalating tyranny. He started small, with intimidation. Then, he took the harvest from the farmers. Next, he demanded tribute, young men for his army, women for his service. Kyle's voice hardened. Those who resisted Mima disappeared. Their villages burned, just like the one Alara described. Elias listened, his gut clenching. It was the same pattern, the same insidious creep of terror he'd seen in other conflict zones, but amplified by the sheer brutality Kyle described. How did he gain so much power? Elias asked, baffled by the scale of Volkov's reach. The regional government, the authorities, they should have stopped him. Kale snorted, a dry, bitter sound. The authorities, they are either too weak, too afraid, or too corrupt to interfere. Volkov has like friends in high places. He paused, navigating around a fallen log. He has an inside man, someone who feeds him information, ensures his operations go unchallenged, someone who benefits from the chaos he creates. The word sent a jolt through Elias. An inside man? Corruption. It fit the pattern of so many conflicts he'd seen. But who? He's also been consolidating supplies. Quayle continued, his voice grim. We've seen unusual movements of weapons, medical supplies, even fuel. More than a local militia would need. There are whispers of a bigger plan, something beyond just controlling these few villages. They reached a small, hidden cave, barely a crevice in the rock face, but offering temporary shelter. Kyle gestured for Elias to enter, then pulled a tattered blanket from his own pack, offering it to Elias to press against his bleeding shoulder. This will help. We rest here for a short time. As Elias applied pressure to his wound, the pain sharp but manageable, he connected the dots, the systematic burning of villages, the growing stockpiles, the unseen collaborator. It all pointed to a calculated, long-term strategy. Not just random acts of terror. Volkov wasn't just a warlord, he was a pawn, or perhaps a key player, in something far larger and more sinister. Do you know who this inside man is? Elias pressed, his voice low. Kyle hesitated, his gaze distant, as if weighing the immense danger of the knowledge. There are rumors, whispers among my people. They speak of a figure high in the regional council, a man named Vasily. He has always been a wolf in sheep's clothing, always spoke of peace, but his actions always seem to benefit Volkov. He controls the allocation of resources, the communication lines. He could easily ensure Volkov's operations remain unseen. Vasily. The name struck another chilling chord. Elias remembered Vasily from intelligence reports. A seemingly benign bureaucrat, always present at peace talks, always advocating for stability. But a gnawing suspicion had always lingered about his rapid rise to power and the uncanny coincidences surrounding Volkov's unchecked expansion. If Kyle was right, Vasily was the architect of Volkov's success. The hidden hand pulling the strings, the pieces of the puzzle began to click into place, forming a terrifying picture of betrayal on a grand scale. The attacks on innocent villages, the suffering of people like Alara and Finn, weren't just the acts of a rogue militia. They were part of a calculated scheme, orchestrated by someone within the very system meant to protect them. The humanitarian aid Elias's sister had been trying to deliver years ago, the aid that had never reached its destination, the chaos that had led to her disappearance. It all suddenly made a horrifying, sickening kind of sense. Vasily's influence, Volkov's terror. It was a symbiotic relationship of corruption and cruelty. This is bigger than just one militia, Elias muttered, his eyes hardening with a grim resolve. This is a betrayal from within, Kyle nodded, his face etched with grim understanding. Volkov uses the conflict as a shield. While everyone fights over borders, he and Vasily are building an empire of stolen resources and fear. They thrive on the suffering of people like Alara and Finn, a low whine from outside the cave. Echo. Elias felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. He peered out, and there, in the deepening gloom, was his loyal K9, his nose nudging something small and huddled. Ilara, holding Finn. "They're here," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. He quickly moved to the cave entrance. Alara's face, pale and streaked with tears, looked up at him with a mixture of terror and overwhelming relief. Finn was still in her arms, limp and barely conscious, his fever burning even hotter. Seeing the direct result of Volkov and Vasily's machinations, solidified Elias's purpose. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about exposing the truth, about ensuring justice for all the innocent lives caught in this web of corruption and cruelty. His personal vendetta against Volkov, sparked by Sarah's memory, now burned with the fierce clarity of a mission to dismantle an entire network of evil. The initial rescue had transformed into a fight for justice, a reckoning for the betrayers. The small cave, barely more than a rocky overhang, became their temporary sanctuary. Alara, her face streaked with dirt and dried tears, carefully laid Finn down on a makeshift bed of dry leaves Kyle had quickly gathered. The boy's breathing was shallow, his small chest barely rising and falling, his skin alarmingly hot to the touch. Elias quickly checked his wound, the infection now a virulent red spreading across his leg. The single dose of antibiotics he'd given earlier was clearly not enough. "We need to get him to proper medical care." "Kyle," Elias said, his voice urgent. "He won't last much longer without it." Kyle nodded, his eyes grimly assessing Finn's condition. "There's an old monastery, deep in the hills beyond the next ridge. It's been abandoned for years, but the monks had a hidden infirmary. My people sometimes used it for emergencies. It might still have some supplies or at least a cleaner environment." "And if it doesn't?" Elias asked, knowing the desperate odds. "Then we pray," Kyle replied, his gaze meeting Elias's. "But first, we deal with Volkov." The thought of facing Volkov, of confronting the man responsible for so much suffering, including Elias's own personal tragedy, ignited a cold, steady fire in his gut. But how they were 3 against an unknown number of well-armed militiamen? "They'll be looking for us," Elias stated, more to himself than Kyle. "They know this terrain. We can't outrun them forever, not with Finn." "No," Kyle agreed, "but we can outsmart them. Volkov is arrogant. He relies on brute force, not cunning, and he relies on his network, his inside man." Kyle's eyes narrowed. "Vasily," Elias nodded. "If we expose Vasily, Volkov loses his protection, his intelligence, his supplies. He becomes just another warlord." "Precisely," Kyle said, a glint in his eye. "But how to expose a man who hides in the shadows, who controls the flow of information?" Elias began to outline a plan. A daring, desperate gamble that relied on surprise, psychological warfare, and exploiting Volkov's own weaknesses. "We don't go after Vasily directly. Not yet. We hit Volkov, hard and publicly. We force him into the open. Make him desperate enough to expose his connections." "How?" Kyle asked, intrigued. "His supply lines," Elias explained, a strategic glint in his eyes. "You said he's stockpiling. Those supplies are his lifeblood if we hit them, if we destroy them. He'll be forced to react, to come out from behind his patrols." Kyle considered this, then nodded slowly. "There's a main cache, hidden in an old logging camp. Deep in the valley, it's heavily guarded, but it's where he keeps his most valuable assets. Weapons, fuel, the money he extorts." "Perfect," Elias said, a grim smile touching his lips. "We hit the cache. We don't just destroy it, we make a statement. We leave evidence that points to Vasily. Something that will make Volkov panic. Make him believe Vasily is betraying him. And then Volkov will come for us," Elias stated, his gaze hard. "He won't send his men. He'll come himself, driven by rage and fear of exposure. That's when we take him down, publicly. And when he's broken, he'll expose Vasily to save his own skin." Kyle looked at Elias, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. A dangerous plan, but audacious. He looked towards Alara, who was gently stroking Finn's forehead. "For them, it is worth the risk." They spent the next hour meticulously planning, Elias drawing on his military expertise, Kyle sharing his intimate knowledge of the terrain and Volkov's usual movements. Echo lay vigilant at the cave entrance, occasionally glancing back at the children, a silent, watchful guardian. As twilight deepened, a low, desperate moan escaped Finn's lips. His fever was spiking again. Alara clutched him tighter, her own small body trembling. The urgency was palpable. They had to act now. "I will lead you to the cache," Kyle said. Rising, "It's a long way, but it's defensible. We will create a diversion, draw the guards away, then you strike." Elias nodded, his rifle gripped firmly in his hand. His shoulder ached, but the pain was a dull background hum to the roaring resolve in his ears. This was it. The reckoning, They moved silently through the increasingly dark forest, Kyle leading, Elias following with Echo by his side. They left Ilara and Finn hidden deep within the monastery ruins, ensuring their safety was paramount. Elias had given Ilara his last medical kit, showing her how to administer basic first aid if Finn worsened while they were gone. Leaving them behind was agonizing, but it was their only chance. Hours later, they reached a vantage point overlooking the old logging camp. Below, a sprawling complex of dilapidated wooden buildings and hastily erected watchtowers. Fires burned in makeshift barrels, casting dancing shadows. Armed guards patrolled, their figures silhouetted against the flickering light. And in the center, a large, reinforced structure, the main cache. "There it is," Kyle whispered, his voice grim. Volkov's heart. Elias took a deep breath, the cold night air filling his lungs as he looked at Kyle, then at Echo, who stood ready, a coiled spring of lethal efficiency. This was for Sarah, for Finn and Ilara, for all the nameless victims of Volkov's brutality. Justice would be served. The climax was upon them, a dangerous dance with destiny under the cover of a moonless night. The night air crackled with a cold tension as Elias, Kyle, and Echo positioned themselves for the assault on Volkov's cache. Below them, the logging camp hummed with a false sense of security, the flickering barrel fires casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Elias checked his rifle one last time, the weight of it familiar and comforting in his hands. His shoulder throbbed, a dull ache that served as a constant reminder of the stakes. "Remember the plan." "Kyle," Elias whispered, his voice low and firm. "Diversion. Draw them out." And Echo, "You stick to Kyle until I give the signal." Echo nudged Kale's hand with his wet nose, a silent affirmation of his loyalty. Kale gave a curt nod, his face a mask of grim determination. He melted away into the tree line, a ghost in the shadows, heading for the far side of the camp where a smaller, less guarded fuel depot was located. His task was to create enough chaos to pull the main guards away from the central cache. Elias waited, every nerve ending tingling, listening to the symphony of the night, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, the distant, repetitive call of a night bird. He counted the seconds, his gaze fixed on the reinforced structure housing Volkov's stolen wealth. Then, a sudden, blinding flash erupted from the far side of the camp, followed by a muffled explosion and the splintering sound of wood. Flames shot skyward, illuminating the camp in a grotesque orange glow. Alarms blared, and shouts of "Fire, fire at the fuel depot!" rippled through the night. The camp erupted into pandemonium. Guards scrambled, rushing towards the blaze, their attention completely diverted. "Now," Elias murmured to himself. He moved swiftly, silently, descending the slope towards the main cache. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and burning timber. He could hear the shouts of Volkov's men, their disorganized cries of alarm. This was his window. He reached the perimeter of the cache building, a sturdy, padlocked wooden structure. 2 guards remained, their backs turned, their attention still on the distant fire. Elias moved like a shadow, slipping behind them, a swift, precise strike to the back of each neck. And both men crumpled, unconscious. Elias quickly disarmed them, tucking their weapons away. He couldn't afford to be weighed down. The padlock on the main door was old, rusted. Elias produced a small set of lock-picking tools from a hidden pouch on his belt, a skill learned out of necessity in compromised zones. His fingers worked with practiced precision, the delicate clicks echoing in the tense silence. After a few agonizing seconds, the tumblers aligned and the padlock sprang open. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, revealing the interior of the cache. It was a treasure trove of ill-gotten gains crates stacked high with assault rifles, boxes of ammunition, jerry cans of fuel, and several large, padlocked chests, undoubtedly containing stolen money and valuables. A grim testament to Volkov's reign of terror. Elias moved quickly, setting timed charges he carried in a specialized pouch. He couldn't take everything, but he could destroy it all. As he worked, he found a small, leather-bound ledger. He opened it. Scanning the pages, it was a meticulous record of transactions names, dates, amounts, and among the names, repeated over and over, were coded entries that Elias instantly recognized as payments to VSLY. Vasily, hard proof of the betrayal. He quickly tore out the relevant pages, tucking them into his uniform. This was the leverage he needed. He set the final charge, adjusted the timer, and then, before leaving, he retrieved a small, ornate dagger from one of the chests. It was a symbol of Volkov's family, one he recognized from intelligence briefings. He plunged it into the central table, pinning a note to it, a message left by Kyle, written in the local dialect, hinting at Vasily's treachery. It was a subtle act of psychological warfare designed to sow discord and panic. He slipped out of the cash building just as the first militiamen, realizing the fire was a diversion, began to return. He heard their confused shouts, then their enraged roars as they discovered their unconscious comrades and the open door of the cache. The cache, it's been hit. Elias melted back into the shadows, making his way to their predetermined rendezvous point. Kyle was already there, Echo at his side, both unharmed. Echo immediately bounded to Elias, nudging his good hand. "Did you get it?" Kale whispered, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "And more," Elias replied, holding up the torn pages of the ledger. Vasily's name, in black and white. Just as he finished speaking, a thunderous explosion ripped through the night. The main cache erupted, a cataclysm of fire and shrapnel. The entire camp shuddered. Secondary explosions followed as the fuel and ammunition ignited. The once orderly logging camp became a raging inferno, a symbol of Volkov's crumbling empire. "He'll be enraged," Kyle stated, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "He will come for us himself." And he did, within minutes. A lone figure, larger than the others, his face contorted with unbridled fury, emerged from the smoke and chaos of the burning camp. Commander Volkov! He was screaming orders, but his men were too scattered, too terrified by the destruction. Volkov was armed, a heavy automatic rifle clutched in his hands, and his eyes burned with a singular, murderous intent. He bypassed his chaotic men, heading straight for the path Elias and Kyle had used to approach. He knew this land, and he knew who had done this. Thorn Dumayachlaib. Volkov's voice ripped through the night, a roar of pure hatred. "You'll pay for this." Elias stepped out from behind a large rock, his rifle raised. "No, Volkov, you will..." The confrontation was swift, brutal, and decisive. Volkov, blinded by rage, charged recklessly. Elias, despite his injury, moved with precision, anticipating his opponent's every move. He used the terrain to his advantage, forcing Volkov into a narrow choke point. Kyle, observing from a distance, provided crucial cover fire, forcing Volkov to expose himself. Echo, unleashed by a silent command from Elias, lunged, distracting Volkov at a critical moment. The fight was over in less than a minute. Volkov, disarmed and disoriented, found himself facing Elias, who held his rifle steady. The barrel pointed directly at Volkov's chest. "You're done." "Volkov?" Elias said, his voice cold, devoid of emotion. "Your reign of terror is over." Volkov, defeated, spat on the ground. "You think this changes anything? My power is too great. Vasily will protect me." Elias smiled grimly. "Vasily won't protect you. He'll disavow you. And these." He held up the torn pages of the ledger. "Are the proof. When this gets out, your network crumbles. Every stolen penny, every burned village, every innocent life you destroyed, it all comes back to you. And to Vasily. And Volkov's eyes widened in dawning horror. He looked from Elias to the ledger, then back to the burning camp. His empire reduced to ashes, the raw animal fury drained from him, replaced by a desperate, palpable fear. Justice, hard won and brutally delivered, had finally arrived. The first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in soft hues of rose and gold as Elias. Kale and Echo made their way back to the hidden monastery. The air, once thick with the acrid scent of smoke, now carried the fresh, earthy aroma of the awakening forest behind them. The smoldering ruins of Volkov's cache served as a grim monument to a tyrant's downfall. Volkov himself, broken and pathetic, had been handed over to a small, isolated outpost of legitimate, albeit underfunded. Regional authorities Kyle had contacted. The ledger pages, proof of Vasily's corruption, were sent with him. Ensuring the truth would eventually unravel the entire web of deceit, Elias's shoulder throbbed. A dull, constant ache. But the pain was overshadowed by a profound sense of relief and, surprisingly, a burgeoning hope. The personal vendetta, long a bitter companion, had finally found its resolution. They arrived at the monastery just as the sun began to peek over the highest peaks, casting long, ethereal shadows through the ancient stone archways. Elias's heart pounded with a nervous anticipation he hadn't felt in years. He'd done his part. Now it was up to Finn. He found Alara curled beside her brother, her small hand still clutching his. Her eyes were wide open, staring intently at Finn's face. A silent vigil. Echo immediately went to them, nudging Alara gently with his nose. A soft whine escaping his throat. Alara looked up, her face etched with exhaustion, but a flicker of hope ignited in her eyes as she saw Elias. "Sergeant Elias, you came back." "Always," Elias murmured, kneeling beside them. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and placed it on Finn's forehead. The fever had broken. It was still warm, but nowhere near the burning heat of the night before. He's sleeping," Alara whispered, her voice barely audible. "His breathing is better, and the redness, it's not as bad." Elias carefully unbandaged Finn's leg. The angry streaks of infection had receded, replaced by a less virulent redness. The swelling had gone down. The crude bandage and Elias's single antibiotic dose, coupled with the monastery's cooler, cleaner environment, had bought them time. Finn was still weak, but he was alive. He was going to make it. A wave of profound relief washed over Elias, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He hadn't failed. This time, he hadn't failed. He looked at Alara, her small face radiating a quiet joy he hadn't seen before. The transformation was subtle, but undeniable. The terror that had clouded her eyes was beginning to recede, replaced by a fragile, dawning peace. Kyle, observing from a respectful distance, approached them. "I contacted the relief organizations in the next valley," he said, his voice quiet. "They have medical teams. They are sending a unit now. They will reach the monastery by midday." Alara's eyes widened, shimmering with tears of relief. "Thank you," she whispered to Kale, then looked back at Elias. Her gaze filled with an unspoken gratitude that transcended words. Over the next few hours, while they waited for the medical team, Elias sat with Alara, listening to her quiet stories about her village, about Finn's mischievous spirit, about the simple joys they had known before the darkness descended. He answered her questions about Echo, letting her gently stroke the K9's soft fur. He saw the resilience in her, a strength born of unimaginable hardship, but also the enduring innocence that even conflict could not fully extinguish. When the medical team arrived, They were a flurry of quiet efficiency. A doctor and two nurses, their faces kind but weary, immediately set about tending to Finn. They confirmed his prognosis severe infection, but caught just in time, with proper care. He would make a full recovery. Alara was whisked away by one of the nurses, offered food and clean clothes, and the promise of reuniting with distant relatives who had also sought refuge in the safer zones. Elias watched her go, a small, grateful smile on her face. A profound sense of closure settling over him. Later, as Finn was stabilized and sleeping peacefully on a clean cot, Elias sat on a stone bench in the monastery courtyard, the morning sun warm on his face. Kyle joined him, offering a steaming mug of bitter, herbal tea. "You saved them." "Sergeant Thorne," Kyle said, his voice quiet. "You risked everything for two children who were strangers to you?" Elias took a sip of the tea. "They weren't strangers, Kyle?" "Not really." He thought of Sarah, of the oath he'd made. They were a chance to make things right, a chance to fight for something concrete, something good, and you found your justice. Kyle observed, his gaze insightful. "For them, and for your own past." Elias nodded, looking out at the endless expanse of the forest. The memories of Sarah were still there, but the raw, crushing pain had receded, replaced by a quieter, more hopeful ache. He hadn't been able to save her, but through Finn and Alara, he had found a path to redemption, a way to honor her memory not just through grief, but through selfless action. The weight he'd carried for so long had finally lifted, replaced by a lightness he hadn't realized he'd been missing. He was no longer just a soldier haunted by his past. He was a man who had faced his demons and emerged, if not unscathed, then at least whole again. Weeks later, the oppressive humidity of the border forest had given way to the crisp, clean air of the highlands. Sergeant Elias Thorne stood at the edge of a newly established refugee settlement. The sounds of children's laughter and the distant hum of humanitarian aid vehicles filling the air. His shoulder, though still stiff, was healing well, a faint, linear scar now the only physical reminder of the bullet's passage. Echo sat patiently by his side, his amber eyes fixed on the bustling activity. Volkov's network had indeed unraveled. The evidence Elias provided, coupled with Kyle's testimony and the captured militiamen, had led to a swift investigation. Vasily, exposed as the corrupt official pulling Volkov's strings, was arrested. His complicity in countless atrocities finally brought to light. Justice, though slow and arduous, had ultimately prevailed. The dismantling of Volkov's operation brought a fragile peace to the troubled borderlands, allowing aid to flow more freely in displaced communities to begin the long process of rebuilding. Elias had remained in the region, assisting with the transition, ensuring the information he'd provided was utilized effectively. But his time here was drawing to a close. He and Echo were due to rotate out, back to a different kind of duty, a different kind of life. He felt a profound shift within himself, a lightness that had replaced the crushing weight he'd carried for so long. The ghost of Sarah, once a haunting presence, now felt like a guiding light, a silent affirmation of the good he had done. He spotted them then, across the bustling common area. Alara, her hair now clean and braided, her clothes new and vibrant, was laughing, chasing a brightly colored ball with a group of other children. She looked utterly transformed, the fear gone from her eyes, replaced by the boundless energy of a child, finally given a chance to be just that, a child. And beside her, though still a little pale and favoring his leg, was Finn. He was walking, tentative but steady, his small hand clutched in the grasp of an older woman. A distant Aunt Quell had helped them locate. Elias watched them, a soft smile touching his lips. He hadn't seen them since that morning at the monastery. He had deliberately kept his distance, knowing they needed space to heal, to find their own new normal. But seeing them now, thriving, living, filled him with a quiet, profound joy that surpassed any military commendation or act of valor. Echo, sensing Elias's focus, let out a soft whine and nudged his hand. Elias looked down at his loyal companion. "They're doing well, aren't they, boy?" Echo responded with a wag of his tail, his eyes conveying a depth of understanding that Elias had always found remarkable, the bond forged in terror. Between a hardened soldier, a loyal K9, and two innocent children, was unspoken but unbreakable. It had transcended duty, procedure, and even the brutal realities of war. It had been a choice, an oath made in a moment of desperate empathy, and it had fundamentally altered the course of Elias's life. He was no longer defined by his losses, but by the lives he had helped save. He turned to Kyle, who stood beside him, observing the scene with a quiet satisfaction. "Thank you, Kale, for everything." Kyle met his gaze, his green eyes holding a rare warmth. "You found your purpose." Sergeant Thorne. "Some men fight for flags, some for power. You fought for children? That is a greater victory than any battlefield could offer." Elias nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He would leave this place soon. He would return to a different world, but he would carry the memory of Alara and Finn with him always. They were a testament to resilience, to the enduring power of innocence, and to the quiet heroism that could emerge even in the darkest of times. He had come to this place, haunted and broken, but he was leaving it with a mended spirit, a renewed sense of meaning, and a profound understanding that some battles were fought not with bullets, but with compassion, courage, and an unwavering commitment to justice. His heart, once hardened by grief, now held new hope, a quiet promise that the fight for good was always worth it.